What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a Warlock build for Baldur's Gate 3. With patch 8 releasing and adding 12 new subclasses, I've been diving back into the game, and if you followed me since I started covering this game way back when, but specifically around launch especially, you've probably heard me mention that I wanted to play a Warlock that was as close to a Hexblade as possible, and then patch 8 just added the Hexblade subclass for the Warlock, which is a personal favorite of mine. And given that my previous Warlock build for the game was mostly just how I ran through the game the first time before a bunch of things like items and stuff was known, there was frankly a lot to improve on there. And then obviously with this giving me the opportunity to do that exactly the way I wanted, I thought I would update what I would do there and just share that with people as a build. Now, the sort of catch here is how I would play this will actually change a little bit depending on whether you are playing on honor mode or not. Most people probably won't, but the reason for this specifically is that honor mode actually changes exactly how some of the 5th edition rules apply to the game, in particular the way extra attacks stack, meaning that on honor mode we actually can't get a third attack that we could normally get simply by multiclassing a specific way. So as a result, in honor mode, I would go about building this a little differently, and I'm going to mention that right here in the multiclassing section, and also a sort of general overview. So the point of this build is basically to take the already very strong Hexblade Warlock subclass and simply get the most out of it in terms of its actual key abilities, class actions, by combining that, of course, with a Paladin, which is a very common mix, so we can make use of their Divine Smite for extra melee damage, and then a couple of other general bonuses like their fighting style as an example. So normally, if you are not playing on honor mode, the simplest way to go about this would simply be a 6-6 split between both of those classes. But with the Paladin side of that being kind of open, you could go Oath of Vengeance, the recently added Oath of the Crown is also very good, or honestly you could even go Oathbreaker, that is pretty thematically fitting here as well. Truth be told, the main things we need just come from the base Paladin class, and the exact subclass there is just icing on the cake, so do what you want to do there in terms of those, but personally I prefer Oath of Vengeance just generally. Now, I mentioned that if we are on honor mode I would do this slightly different, and the reason for that is that on regular or tactician and below we can stack the extra attacks with our Pact of the Blade and the extra attack of the Paladin to get 3 attacks in a turn. Now the catch here is that that does not work on honor mode, meaning that there's really not much of a reason to take Paladin past 4, which means the split becomes 6 Hexblade Warlock, 4 Paladin, so we make sure that we get their ability score improvement or feat option, and then finally 2 levels of fighter, primarily for their action surge, but that extra fighting style from picking them isn't bad either. Now functionally speaking, that doesn't really change much, a little bit on the resource side, but it will still fundamentally play the same. You would just have action surge and then pick the relevant fighting style and you'd be good to go. But when combining all those things, we get the Hexblade's extremely generous toolkit with things like their Hexblade Curse, their Charisma to their attack and damage rolls straight away, the proficiencies that they get out of the box, such as martial weapons, medium armor, even shields if you want to take it a sword and board route, and we combine that with Paladin primarily to get Divine Smite if we're being honest, and a couple of other abilities depending on what you choose to do there, for fantastic melee damage, some very strong and reliable casting, both in terms of actually debuffing your enemies, simply attacking them, even some ranged options with the evergreen Eldritch Blast, and you've got a character that is just extremely versatile and can do a lot of things very well. Realistically, the only, I would say, downsides to playing this are that you can have a little bit of trouble closing distance on enemies, which we can mitigate a little bit with something like Misty Step, or just using Eldritch Blast in certain situations, but there will be moments where, it's going to be kind of hard to mitigate where you are and where the enemy is, so anything you can do on that front is helpful. And there's plenty of ways to do that in this game, mind you, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, the other side of this is that it is a somewhat resource-intensive way to play, but luckily, pretty much everything we're doing will be regened on a short rest, or at least the bulk of it, outside of the Paladin's spell slots that we could potentially use for Divine Smite. But our Warlock spell slots, the action surge if you are playing on honor mode with the fighter instead, and that allows you to just short rest, regen some stuff, so it's something to keep in mind, but it's not terrible either. But it's definitely a play style that will simply be more effective if you're a little judicious with your resources. From there though, let's talk character creation. So, when it comes to creating this character, I've always been partial to a Tiefling for simply roleplay options. I love to play a Zerial Tiefling. They actually get some abilities that I think are relevant to this, such as Thaumaturgy as a cantrip, which will help you pass intimidation checks or things like that outside of combat, but also Searing Smite as a racial ability, that kind of stuff. So personally, that's just how I like to play, but realistically, if you're going for raw effectiveness, I would actually probably go half-orc, and the reason for that is their very strong set of racial features. Most importantly, though, their Savage Attacks feature. This allows them to, when landing a critical hit with a melee weapon, which we'll be doing a fair bit of, deal an extra dice of weapon damage, so it's triple instead of double. Now, the other catch there is, though, that our Hexblade subclass actually lowers the number we need to get a critical by 1, making it 19 to 20 anyway. So not only would we do more damage with our criticals with an orc, our Hexblade subclass simply makes it a little more likely that we're going to get those criticals. So if I just wanted like max damage, half orc would be the way to go in my opinion. Now class, I obviously want to start out as a Hexblade Warlock. There is a case to be made for doing the paladin levels first, so you could get things like heavy armor if that's what you wanted, but I honestly don't think heavy armor is necessary for this in any way. But then there's also the roleplay side of it, like a paladin who starts out, has problems with their oath and then moves into the Hexblade Warlock subclass. There's a lot of role-playing synergy there as well that I think is a little more validating in terms of that, but for the most part, we're going to start as a Warlock. I know people love to do their dips with this, do what you want to do, I suppose, but personally, I'm intending to play this as a Warlock, so that's where we're going to start. Hexblade Warlock cantrips, we pretty much just want Eldritch Blast and Booming Blade. Booming Blade, a recent addition of patch 8 as well. A fantastic cantrip because we can use it to proc our extra attacks. I actually didn't check to see if that works in Honor mode because I think technically it's not supposed to proc extra attacks in the actual rules, so I don't know if Honor mode rule set affects that or not. But even if it does, it's a really good cantrip, dealing damage to enemies that move once they have been affected by this. Now for our subclass specifically, we get Bind Hexed Weapon right away. This is what is going to allow us to take our charisma to our attack rolls and everything via the subclass feature of Hexed Warrior. You do have to activate that though, remember to do so, or you'll be using your strength for your melee weapon, which won't be great. And then you also get Hexblade Curse right at level 1 as well, which once per short rest for 10 turns, you get your proficiency bonus as damage when attacking the enemy that you've cursed. It also reduces the number needed for a critical hit. Now, because of the short rest requirement, you can effectively do this once per combat generally, and that means you're likely going to want to target the biggest guy you're trying to hit here. So that's certainly something to know. Now, for starting spells, I like to pick up Shield as well as Wrathful Smite. Wrathful Smite's just a little personal thing that I enjoy. We'll have enough choices here to pick up everything we need. But if you wanted to drop Wrathful Smite for like Hellish Rebuke or Hex right at level 1, that's totally fine too, but at level 2, we're going to grab some of that stuff. Now, for background, I always love to pick Charlatan. I think that is just perfect for the Warlock in particular because it gives them a bunch of proficiencies for their skills that we're going to want, such as Deception and Sleight of Hand, which combined with our high charisma makes passing a lot of checks pretty easy. But for our attributes, or our ability points if you prefer, some things to note. We don't need strength. Despite being a melee character, our Hexed Warrior and Hexed Weapon will give us charisma for our attacks immediately. We don't need strength at all. So what I like to do here is keep charisma at 17 with our +2 bonus, and then what we're going to do ideally is we'll get the +1 to an ability score via Anti-Ethel in Act 1. You can end that fight in a way that gives you the option of basically letting her go in exchange for power, which is another reason you might not want to necessarily start with a Paladin Oath if you don't want to go Oathbreaker, I guess. But if you want to metagame a little, that reward can then take charisma up to 18, and then an ability score improvement will bring it up to 20, which is why I like to do it that way. I like to leave wisdom and intelligence at 10. I mostly just try to avoid taking penalties here. Ideally, constitution can be taken down to 12. That's totally fine. Dexterity to 16. We're going to be wearing medium armor, which means we get a little bit of dex bonus initially, and then some armor later is actually going to allow us to get our full bonus, which in this case would just be the +1, but it's still pretty good. And then a higher dexterity also gives you more initiative and is more useful to us than those other 3. This puts strength at 9, which is technically a penalty, but not really a huge deal for this particular character. But that is at least how I personally like to split it. Which brings us to the leveling up phase. So at level 2, we're sticking with Warlock until level 6, by the way, but at level 2 we can pick up Hellish Rebuke as well as Hex. If you're playing the game, this is basically when you finish the prologue tutorial area, which is why I don't necessarily think you need to take these at 1, but Hex is fantastic, lets us force disadvantage on an ability of our choice while also just dealing extra damage when we hit that enemy with our attacks. And what's more, it's a bonus action. So with Hexblade Curse being a bonus action but only usable once per combat, basically the rest of the time what we can do is instead cast Hex with our bonus action, freeing our regular action for actual attacks as an example. And then Hellish Rebuke just deals damage to anything that hits you, which is always great. Sort of a Warlock classic on that front. Now for our invocations, I always like to take Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast here, which are upgrades to Eldritch Blast to make it stronger, and you can either knock back enemies, which is just fantastic for some combat encounters where you can knock them into instant death, and then Agonizing Blast adds your Charisma modifier to the Eldritch Blast damage. Pretty classic ones there. The other one you're probably going to want is Devil's Sight, but we'll pick that up later. Now at level 3, we pick up another spell. This is where I like to pick up Cloak of Daggers. Cloak of Daggers is really strong, especially in the first act of the game, and because of our Warlock spell slots, it actually gets a little stronger as we level up as well, but it's just a really solid Act 1 spell. But you don't necessarily need it, and otherwise you're probably going to want to pick up Misty Step, which if you pick Oath of Vengeance is actually available if you take the 6 levels of Paladin later, but also you might consider picking up Darkness to combine it with Devil's Sight. But for our Pact boon, we have to pick Pact of the Blade, otherwise we won't get our extra attack at level 5, and we're gonna need that. Now at level 4, we get an extra cantrip. I usually just like to get Friends so I can cast it. The rest of the cantrips aren't terribly useful for what we're doing. And then for our spell, this is another option to pick up either Misty Step or Darkness. I know people enjoy Shadow Blade, but it's not particularly useful for us in this specific instance. Mostly because I like to go two-handed with this build personally, but I trust you're adults enough to make that choice for yourself. Now for our feat at level 4, this is where I prefer to take the ability improvement to Charisma, which combined with Anti-Ethel's boon, which won't show up in the level screen by the way, it'll just show it at 19, will take your Charisma to 20. Now at level 5, we get another spell. This time it'll be level 3. You might consider Hunger of Hadar, which is a great one, or perhaps Counterspell, but we'll also get an Eldritch Invocation at this level. This is where I typically like to pick up Devil's Sight, which will give us vision and magical and non-magical darkness. And then lastly, for the Warlock at level 6, we pick up yet another spell. I've pretty much told you about the important ones already, so the rest of it comes down to that at level 6 we pick up Accursed Spectre, which means when we kill a humanoid afflicted with our Hexblade Curse, we can raise them as a specter, which will help us in combat until we next long rest. This is a actually pretty good ability. That specter will act on its own, but it obviously provides something for enemies to hit. It will also attack enemies that you've just hit with its right behind you ability, so when you hit an enemy it will teleport to them and also attack them. It even has a pull ability to bring enemies to it, and there's 3 different variations of it depending on the type of enemy, or the size of it rather, that you kill to make this specter. Very good little ability, and it's like the main reason we took this to level 6, and a huge part of the Hexblade in general. Now, that's where it gets a little bit different, because then we're going to take our Paladin levels. Now, if we are playing on Honor mode, we're just taking 4. If you're playing below that, probably just take it to 6 to make it easy. Now, level 7 for our Paladin would just be the multi-class, obviously, but also whatever oath you want. I would recommend either Vengeance or the Crown, but again, you can go Oathbreaker as well if you want. Perfectly valid way to go. The main difference is the spells they're going to be getting while we have them, and a couple of smaller abilities. For instance, Oath of Vengeance can add radiant damage to their attacks or an allies, and then the Oath of the Crown can do similar things but also gets a group-wide heal or forces enemies to focus on them as an example, which depending on how you build the fighting style at level 8 might make that decision for you. So here's where you really need to pick whether you want to go two-handed or sword and board. So two-handed will generally give us a little more damage, and if you want to go that route, you want to pick up Great Weapon Fighting, basically letting you re-roll a 1 or a 2 on damage dice with a two-handed weapon, which will obviously potentially give you more damage. Whereas if you are playing sword and board, you want to go with defense, which will give you an extra AC. And what's more, the reason you might want to do that is because normally this build's AC will probably be around 23 or 24, depending on your exact item setup. But if you choose to go the shield route, you can actually push that a little bit higher even before buffs, or even trying to use something like Mirror Image, and it can make you a little bit tankier and survivable if you want to go that route. It's not required. I prefer two-handed myself, but I just wanted to note that it is possible. Now at this level, we'll also start getting paladin spells, but more on those in a second. Now at level 9, we pick up a couple paladin abilities. In the case of Oath of Vengeance, this will be Abjure Enemy, as well as Vow of Enmity, and then you'll get a little bit more spells as well. Personally, I like to take just all of the smite abilities, and then if you want to take something like Shield of Faith, that's fine too, but generally we don't need the paladin spells so much as we do Divine Smite. Now, at level 10, we're going to pick another feat primarily. Now, the catch is you can either take an ability score improvement or an actual feat here. If you want to take the ability improvement, I would probably throw it into Dex, because this will give you more initiative and a little bit of extra AC because of the medium armor we'll be wearing. It's not explicitly required that you do that though, and personally, I prefer to take a feat. Either Savage Attacker or Great Weapon Master. Honestly, dealer's choice. I think they're good for different reasons. Most people will tell you to take Great Weapon Master. Obviously, don't take that if you're not using two-handed weapons, mind you, as its main thing is about doing that, but in general, if we land a critical hit or kill a target at all, we could take another melee weapon attack with a bonus action. The reason I don't like to take this is that if you've been paying attention, our bonus actions are likely going to be used on things like Misty Step, Hex, or even our Hexblade Curse, which that doesn't exactly leave us a lot of room for an extra attack via a bonus action. Now the catch is, though, that the other part of this is that attacks with melee weapons we're proficient in can deal an additional 10 damage at the cost of a -5 to the attack roll. I don't like taking that penalty personally. That's not insignificant, especially if you're playing on higher difficulties, and if you miss, it sucks, so you can toggle it on and off. So again, I personally don't like Great Weapon Master because of those reasons. I know a lot of people enjoy it. Personally, what I prefer is actually Savage Attacker. Savage Attacker causes you to roll your damage twice and use the higher result. That is useful all the time instead of situationally the way Great Weapon Master is. But that's just my personal thinking on it. Obviously, you can do whatever you want there. Now, if you are playing on Honor mode or just a more difficulty in general, this is actually where you would stop Paladin levels, grab 2 levels of Fighter for their fighting style, as well as the Action Surge. Fighting style is obviously whatever it is you want to do fighting style wise, but also Action Surge just lets you double up on an action for a turn, which is obviously very good, and it can make up for the lack of that third extra attack that we get from taking 6 levels of Paladin on lower difficulties. But for the Paladin levels, at level 11, which would be our 5th level of Paladin, this is where we get that third extra attack if we are not on Honor mode. Coincidentally, this, if you are an Oath of Vengeance Paladin, will also give you Misty Step, which is a little late in the game to be getting it, to be honest, but just something to note, I suppose. And then finally, for level 12, which would be level 6 of Paladin, is where we pick up our Aura of Protection. This allows you and any nearby allies to get a very substantial bonus to saving throws, which can be just generally very useful. Now from there, let's talk gear and Illithid powers before we start mentioning combat. So for gear, there's a few items we want. I'm going to kind of talk you through what this progression looks like. So for our helmet, what we're going to wind up with is Birthright. We can buy this from Sorceress Sundries in Act 3, and this is going to give us another +2 to our charisma, and because we're using it, that's huge for us. So the thing is, up until that point, literally just whatever helmet you want that you can use that isn't heavy armor. There is no one specific right option there, but this is what you want to end the game with, but because it's available so late, you're going to spend most of the game with something else, but this should be your goal. Now, for our cloak, I personally like to grab the Cloak of Protection just for the free AC and saving throw. You can pick that up from a vendor in Act 2 at the Last Light Inn. Again, before then, just use whatever you want, but most of the cloaks don't start becoming available until around then anyway. And then for our armor, up until Act 2, you want to get whatever you want. But in Act 2, at the Last Light Inn, we can buy the Yuan-Ti armor, which is essentially this armor that I'm showing you, the Armor of Agility, with a slightly worse AC, but it does the same thing, really, which is going to let us add our full dexterity modifier to our armor class, which is normally limited to 2 for medium armor. Now in Act 3, you can upgrade that to the Armor of Agility from the armor vendor right near the square. which does the same thing but has 17 armor class. So whether you have just 16 dexterity, or if you're doing anything else to raise that higher than that, you'll get a pretty big bonus out of this, or at least more so than you would normally. And if you combine that with a shield, you'll be in at least the mid-20s in terms of AC without any sort of buffs. If you don't want to use a shield, you're probably looking at like 22, 23, give or take, which is still a pretty good AC, as it were. But for your gloves, not really a right answer there. Honestly, just anything that gives you a little extra damage. There's a few options there. If you take some Infernal Iron to Damien the Smith, he can get you the Helldust gloves here, which will add some fire damage, which in combination with the Everburn blade that you're likely to be using at that point is pretty good. But realistically, just the best gloves you can get will be fine. For shoes, we can pick up the Evasive Shoes, also at the Last Light Inn in Act 2. This will give us another armor class as well as a +1 to acrobatics. If you don't want to use those, you could instead use the Disintegrating Nightwalkers from the Underdark. Specifically, they drop off one of the boss guys there, the Drow dude. And this is actually another way to get Misty Step and also become immune to Enwebbed, Entangled, and Ensnared, plus Grease or Ice knocking you prone as well. So those boots are also really good. You can choose whichever one floats your boat or just switch them out situationally. Now, for our amulet, I would recommend either the Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet, which will, on a critical once per rest, guarantee paralyzation on the enemy, which can be really strong against certain bosses. So if you don't want to wear that amulet, or if you want to give it to someone else, you could just grab something like any good amulet, like for instance the Amulet of Greater Health from the House of Hope in Act 3 would be good, if you want to bother to steal it. But you got some options there, is my point. Now, for rings, the one I would definitely recommend you pick up is a Strange Conduit Ring. When we are concentrating on a spell, we will deal extra damage as psychic damage with our attacks, specifically weapon attacks, which we'll be using, of course, and because of our build, we'll also be using concentration spells a fair bit. So that will be active pretty often, actually. So that's just a little extra damage you can get if you want it. Other rings that I would recommend are the Ring of Protection that you can get from Act 1 if you steal the idol and give it to the children in the Druid's Grove. That's just a free AC. And then if you pick up Killer's Sweetheart, which will allow you, when you kill a creature, to guarantee your next attack roll to be a critical hit once per long rest. That one's pretty good as well. Now that brings us to weapons. So you got some options here. The cool thing is we get one of the best swords for Act 1 pretty much immediately right in the prologue. If you get Commander Z something or another dead in the prologue area where you fight him, you can loot his corpse before you leave the Mind Flayer ship, and he will have the Everburn blade, which is a really good great sword for the entirety of Act 1. You'll take that for quite some time. In fact, if you wanted to, you could take it all the way to Baldur's Gate City. But around Act 2, you will start getting some alternatives, such as Corpse Grinder is a good one, which is a hammer that is basically like the Foe Breaker that I'm showing here. But a mace you can get in Act 3 is called a Foe Breaker, which lets you, via its lethal weapon ability, ignore bludgeoning resistance, which is obviously pretty good. And then if we miss an attack, we deal a little bit of bludgeoning damage anyway. But there's also some cool stuff like Baldurin's Giant Slayer sword. If you finish up Will's personal story, you'll come by this naturally, and the reason I would avoid using this one a little bit is because its primary thing uses your strength modifier, which we are not using. But if you want to use its ability, Giant Form, that will increase your size and cause you to deal extra damage anyway, while also giving you temporary hit points, advantage on strength checks and saving throws. So it's not entirely meritless to use that instead, mind you. Or if you are playing as a Githyanki for some reason, you could grab the silver swords that are available through Lae'zel's quest typically, or just that content in general that are really good for a Githyanki specifically. But honestly, any good two-handed weapon is pretty much going to do the job. You could even branch out and do stuff like polearms if you really wanted to. Whole lot of options in that regard. But that's kind of the general gist of the gear setup and the stuff you should be after. Now, before we start fully talking about combat, I wanted to first mention the Illithid Powers. So these are optional, you don't need them for any of this to work, but if you really want to just be overpowered, those powers are good for that. And basically we want the usual suspects if you decide to use them. Psionic Backlash is a great one. So is Cull the Weak, which will instantly kill an enemy if they drop below the health threshold of the amount of powers you are going to have. So if you want to grab all of them and go full Illithid, Cull the Weak is tremendously powerful, probably one of the strongest, I would say. But Favorable Beginnings is also really good, increases our first attack roll or ability check against a target, equal to our proficiency bonus, a really great opener, and then that will actually lead you into Luck of the Far Realms, which will guarantee a critical hit hit against an enemy once per long rest. Again, a great way to push through some damage if you want. And then passively, you could pick up something like Ability Drain, and then the rest of them, if I were to grab them, it would mostly be to empower Call the Weak. I probably wouldn't actually be using them that much. So there's that. But from there, let's finally talk a little bit about combat. So the really cool thing about this setup is that you can kind of do a little bit of everything. If you want to just run in and smash something really hard in melee, you can do that. It's probably your best damage dealer, actually. If you Hexblade Curse a humanoid enemy, it won't work on like constructs and oozes, plants, things like that. Just be aware of what you are Hexblade cursing if you want to actually raise this specter. And even then, just as a little warning, sometimes I couldn't get it to work. It's supposed to work via a reaction, and sometimes it didn't trigger even if I hit the right person and everything. Seemed rare enough that that happened, but it did happen sometimes. That summon at that point, then again, as I mentioned earlier, acts on its own, helps us out in combat, does more damage, hits things. We also have ranged options via our spells. Eldritch Blast, etc. We get spells that will empower our melee swings if you want to go that route as well through the Paladin. So there really is just a lot this class can do, but in a sort of perfect storm situation, what's going to give you the most damage is making several well-placed melee attacks against a big enemy for hundreds of damage. And the way we're going to do that is simply by walking up to an enemy, hitting them with Hexblade Curse, ideally for the extra damage, followed up by something like Booming Blade, to open with, which is going to apply that damage when they move if they try to get away from you. And then you can just follow up with powerful melee swings. And through all of this, we're going to be using the Paladin side of things to just Divine Smite to add on to that damage. Now, depending on what you hit, because Divine Smite does do more damage against certain types of enemies, including whether or not it's a critical, etc., a really good melee swing is probably anywhere from like 90 to roughly 120 damage. And we're going to do that like 3 times, potentially 4 if you're using the action surge side of things with a fighter. And that's pretty good all on its own, but again, as a reminder, if we kill something, we can then raise our Spectre, which will then join us. So on the next turn, when we hit something again, that Spectre is actually going to come in and attack via right behind you. And once we've placed our Hexblade Curse, probably, we can then spend subsequent turns using our Hex ability, which will actually give us extra damage on our swings as well, plus debuff the enemy while we're at it. And then via things like, for instance, Misty Step, we can close the gap on various enemies to more adequately position ourselves via our bonus action as well before we start swinging away. So when you put all of this together, thanks to our high charisma and skills and stuff, we've got a character that is fantastic for the roleplay side of things, pretty easily passing checks, even on honor mode where you can't save. We've got the potential for some pretty brutal melee swings that will then potentially summon up more help to aid us, while simultaneously being able to debuff the enemy. And that's before we even start talking about the AoE options, because while all of that is great, you don't have to necessarily do that against large groups of enemies. Using our Devil's Sight, you could drop Darkness against larger groups, or even a single one, I suppose, if it doesn't have the vision, at which point you can use that Devil's Sight to more easily hit them while avoiding damage, and couple that with something like the Hunger of Hadar, which will deal damage to anything that is in its range. We can lock enemies down, deal AoE damage this way, or even simply attack from the distance with an upgraded Eldritch Blast. And given that pushing invocation that we will likely have taken, there are certain situations where we can also just push things to their death in a single hit, from range even. So when you put all of that together, no matter how you slice it, it is a very strong class that can do a wide variety of things, and that is before you start even accounting for what your other teammates are going to be doing. But with all of that said and done, I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video. So hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you wind up trying it out, I would love to know what you think. Honestly, nothing about this is too crazy. It's pretty standard ways to build a class like this, but nonetheless, it's something I enjoy a lot, and so I wanted to share the specifics of it for people who may not know. But whatever the case may be, I'd love to know what you think about it down below, or anything else, or variations, etc., in ways you particularly like to build this stuff up. For instance, Warlock and Sorcerer, specifically the Shadow Magic Sorcerer that has been recently added, could be a fun combo as an example. But all of that ultimately means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.